astrology, the sun and moon represent the masculine and feminine principles, while Aries and Libra represent the axis of relationships. Tune in when Chris Flisher and his Aries sun go head-to-head with Debra Clement and her Libra moon about a subject near and dear to everyone's heart. Relationships. Will the ram run roughshod over a weltering Libra moon, or will the moon's sweet powers of persuasion stop the Aries beast in his tracks? To find out, tune in to a very special presentation of He Says, She Says Astrology with Chris Flisher and Debra Clement.
Welcome. This is He Says, She Says Astrology. I'm Debra Ann Clement.
And I'm Chris Flisher. And we have been doing this show for quite some time. We've been on a bit of a hiatus. And we took a little bit of a pause to regain our sanity, what little is left of it. And we're back doing our dueling He Says, She Says dialogue here. And we're talking about the houses today. We're going to talk about which house, Debra?
We're going to talk about the seventh house. I know that answer.
Wow. You know, if there's one house that everybody wants to know about, it's the seventh house, right? How many of your clients want to know about the seventh house? Every one of them, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, when I was younger and learning about astrology, that's where my interest was. You know, with my Libra moon and being so into relationships, of course, I wanted to know all about the relationships.
That's right. Those high school sweethearts, you know, you got to figure out where they are in those charts. And that's what the main thing, because, you know, astrology more than anything else is about, you know, getting along. It's all, we've had this conversation before. It really is about relationships. Every house is about relationships. And all of us, we're in a relationship with everybody and everything in our lives. But the seventh is juicy because that's where the love happens.
Not only that, but when you think about it, that's also where your competitors are and your adversaries.
Yes, and your close friends. So there's this duality all the time.
And your business partners. Don't forget the business partners.
They can be your enemies or your allies.
It's a crowded house in that respect. And, you know, to be honest, even though, you know, we find parents in the fourth and the 10th or siblings are in the third, the seventh house is one-to-one relationships. So even our family relationships, quite frankly, some of them, right, also fall into one-to-one relationships. Sometimes you have siblings that compete with each other.
And, you know, the thing that you'll find interesting is you'll find that people, we all have a bevy of a wide array of relationships in our lives. All of us have our hairdressers, our dentists, our, you know, the postman, our next door neighbor, our lovers, all of us. And it's interesting. Those of you, we all know that there's certain people we get along with better than others. And that usually points to a compatibility in the seventh house. Absolutely.
Because those are your close relationships. Those are your committed relationships.
The ones you have chosen to spend time with rather than just have them be casual. Now, some of them may be casual, and that's fine. They can be casual, but they have you. This is a conscious choice on your part to make these your relationships.
Absolutely. They're more than just that passing acquaintance or the person you see at some, you know, monthly meeting.
Yeah. And I think that, I mean, more often than not, if I look back over the years of being, you know, doing readings and consultations for people, I would say that this is the one issue that more often than not, people really want to know about. Should I get divorced? Is this the right guy or the right girl for me? You know, all of these questions. Are my boss is a real headache? Why? And I say, well, it's difficult getting your boss's birth chart, I think. But if you can, you might know a lot about them.
And if you can't, we'll look at the 10th house because that's your boss. But that's a topic for another show.
That's a topic for another show. We'll get to that one. We're actually going around and doing the cadent houses, which is the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th. And then we're going to go through and do the next ones and the next ones beyond that. So we're all shut.
Actually, we're doing the cardinal houses.
The cardinal houses. I'm sorry. I got the CA mixed up. My fault.
That's okay. That's okay. Right. Just want to make sure, you know.
No, you got me. See, thank God you're there.
Hey, I'm a Capricorn. It's my job.
I know. Somebody's got to correct the wild, impulsive Aries.
So let's talk about the 7th house. And because it is a big area of interest, certainly for everyone. And so when you look at the 7th house, at least when I look at the 7th house, I see it as telling me when it comes to those committed relationships is really, in many ways, what we need. To some degree, it's also what we attract, but very often it's where we need. To me, and I'll just digress a second, say the 5th house, which is a romantic house, to me, that's more about what I want. Not necessarily what I need, but it's definitely what I want. But the 7th house also brings in the long haul. What do I need for that enduring relationship?
And who can fill that role? Because, you know, ultimately, some of the best relationships I've seen in my years of doing this are those are their opposites, because the opposite brings to you what you need and fills a void that you may not realize you're empty of. And that's where that sort of symbiotic relationship comes, where, you know, fulfilling it's why it's opposite the first house, because it certainly is a reflective quality that needs to be filled.
And it's complementary in some ways as well.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
It's not always complimentary. As anybody who's been divorced will know that.
Well, that's why it's the house of marriage and divorce.
Yeah. Okay.
We like to think of it as marriage, but yeah, it is. It's the house where people sue you as well. And that's why I say your adversaries. But looking at the happier side of it, let's look at that for a moment and talk about relationships. So sometimes you have planets in the seventh house. Sometimes you don't have planets in the seventh house. Sometimes it's better not to have planets in the seventh house, depending on what they are. That's the way I'm going to say that I look at it. But certainly there's a sign on the cusp of the seventh house. And that particular sign and the qualities with that sign very much speaks to, I would say, the type, and even in a general sense, the type of personality. Are you attracted to a strong personality? When I see clients who have Aries on the seventh house, what it tells me is when it comes to partners, they like a strong personality. They want somebody who's decisive, someone who can actually even sort of take care of themselves.
Yeah, that's not too much to ask in a person, I don't think, if you can take care of yourself. Are you self-sufficient? You're not going to be, you don't need a babysitter. But although I do see relationships that are sort of built around that. People sometimes tend to reach out for somebody who's strong because it reminds them of their mother or who knows what. There's all kinds of complexities that get into this.
No, but Aries on the seventh house, like I say, I usually find most clients, it's a strong personality and also someone who's, and I'm going to say, I think it's a very good quality, someone, when I say it's action oriented, right, which is Aries, and they're usually looking for someone who, isn't looking to stay home all the time. Someone who's looking, quite frankly, for adventure, to make some memories in life, to get out, to experience life.
Right. And the sign that's on the cusp of the house is interesting because it does color any planet that might be in that house. It gives a shade. I always think of it, I think in terms of color, because that's a visual thing that I can understand. But it gives it a tinge of color to the sun, to the planets that are in that house, and that's how they manifest. It may soften them or harshen them. There's a certain quality that goes along with that, which is really important to know.
And that's why I always say, right, we have to look at the entire chart.
Always have to look at the entire chart. The seventh, when you mention friends, some of your closest friends, you're going to find them through your seventh house. You're going to find interesting. And then when we see planets in the seventh house, I think you're going to see a heightened awareness of how that plays out. For example, if you had Mercury in the seventh house, you're going to probably want a communicative partner, someone who you can relate to, you can speak with, who's open, who's not afraid to be self-expressive.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I'm going to go to a different planet and say that if you have Neptune in the seventh house, and that to me, Neptune, it can go one of two ways. And, on the more evolved sense, you can attract people and be attracted to people who are artists, who are creatives, who are intuitives, who are certainly just, let's say, more evolved. But very often Neptune in the seventh initially, because, I like to think we're here to learn, people can be involved with others who are emotionally unavailable, or people, quite frankly, who, I hate to say, they need to be saved, or they drain in some way, shape, or form.
There's a lot of baggage. Yeah,
Neptune in the seventh it's about awareness, because at the end of the day, right, this is one of the benefits and blessings of astrology. It's that awareness. So if you have Neptune in the seventh house, it can be wonderful, but you do have to be aware. Is there a pattern in your life? Do you attract people, like I say, who have this pattern? If it is, you need to break it.
Yeah. I also think that Neptune would give a person a false sense of what really is happening in some ways. There's a sense of delusion that happens there. And, you may be, I think someone who has a strong Neptune may regard relationships through a unrealistic eye.
And also, some people who have Neptune in the seventh, they actually have commitment issues. They don't recognize it. So they want a partner very much, but in a way they sort of want a partner who's not there. And that's why they're attracted to people who are in situations. It might be a long distance relationship even, but they're not always there.
So in that regard, they act as sort of like an accoutrement to themselves, or a fashion accessory. They're not really there in the sense that we might think of in traditionally terms of, of a relationship that has a give and take reciprocity to it.
Exactly. And let's see, Saturn in the seventh.
I don't think that's a bad placement. I actually like that placement. I've been with people who've had Saturn in the seventh, and they tend to be incredibly loyal and supportive, if not demanding. So there's a dual edge to, as with everything in astrology, there's a duality to it. So the good part of the Saturn is that they sort of keep your feet on the ground, and you hold your feet to the fire and make sure you do what you're supposed to do. But then there's the other side of it that they can tend to be a little bit overbearing sometimes and a bit of a nag.
Well, I have Saturn in the 7th house.
Oh, dear. I didn't know that.
And
well, you're the warm and supportive kind because you're that wonderful Capricorn.
But I will say this about Saturn in the 7th house. I find experiencing it, I'm going to say growing up, friends, that was a big issue for me, having friends, being able to make friends. A little bit of, I'm going to say, loneliness connected to friends. I took it very seriously. And as much as, I hate to admit it, looking back at my youth, I think I was in some ways a demanding friend. I mean, maybe I still am today, but I was certainly a bit of a demanding
I've been meaning to speak to you about that.
Can we do that off air, please?
I'm joking. No, I'm joking.
I know you.
But I think the Saturn. I think there's a certain. It's all the Saturnian qualities we look for. It's sort of like being. Are you a responsible friend? Are you someone that's got my back when the chips are down? Are you the one that's going to? And I think there's a sense of support there that's very, and maybe even a very strong critic. And sometimes they could be a little bit critical, but they're doing it in your best interest. I think.
It's very loyal. That's the one thing I will say about Saturn in the 7th house. If you have it, it's a very loyal placement. We're with you. We are with you until the end. Yeah.
Now, we're hopping around here a bit in the zodiac, but that's okay. That's part of that's part of the fun of the podcast. When we look at, I mentioned Mercury before. We talked about that, but about Venus in the 7th, I think, that's, you got it made there.
I was going to say that it's wonderful for work related too. If you're dealing with people, dealing with the public, Venus in the 7th house, it's charming. It's gracious. It naturally, quite frankly, can attract people. It's considered a popular placement.
Oh, it's very good. And I think that it's something you would want to see in another person, especially if you're looking to if you're doing a sort of a test drive with somebody. I think that Venus also brings about a certain, well, there's a sense of empathy there and a sense of appreciation, I think, which is very deeply rooted in that placement. And empathy is a strong thing, especially if you're in a relationship. One thing we want from relationships is sort of support and feedback about our day. So you come home from a bad day at work, you want someone to unload with. That's the kind of person who you can do that with, I think.
And Venus also, it speaks to beauty, it speaks to values. And so in terms of the unloading, but I think it's more, you can unload because they know the right thing to say. It's like there's this natural gift where they know exactly what to say. And they know exactly when to be quiet and just sort of let you vent. Right.
That's the empathy piece. I think that, what's funny is that more often than not, just someone just listening is just almost invaluable in itself, because even if they're not taking anything that you're saying in, but if they're sitting there nodding their head, you feel as if you're being, compensated and you're being soothed in some way.
You're being recognized. You're being acknowledged. Right. Exactly. Right. Exactly. No, Venus in the 7th, it's a great placement.
Mars. Now, Mars, I think of as being, I can think that it could be a very passionate and also, of course, there's the other side of it too, quick to anger, but quick to be very passionate.
Well, I've got Mars in the 7th as well.
Gosh, I'm really batting 1,000 here. Yeah.
So here's the thing about Mars in the 7th, at least from my experience. I do believe it can be a very passionate, placement. It's also a bit of a combative.
Oh, of course.
Placement. It projects a lot. I mean, I have to say that was something I had to get under control. So Mars in the 7th house, it can be quick to anger, and that's part of an issue too sometimes with relationships. Is you need to have a partner who can deal with that, quite frankly, and isn't very thin-skinned, quite frankly. Because again, it gets annoyed quickly. That's how I tend to think of it for myself, is I can get annoyed very quickly. It's impatient. It can be very impatient with other people.
I think it is passionate. Yeah, for sure. It's sort of indicative of what the sign that it is the ruler of, which is Aries. It sort of has that quick to anger, quick to chill. I mean, quick to heat up and quick to chill. So there's that very, there's this sort of impulsivity driven. It's just boom, strike like a snake might strike, and boom, you strike, and then you're back off and you're calm again. There's that very much of that sort of impulsivity, like you mentioned there.
No, and you need a partner who gets over it as quickly as you do, because not everybody does.
No. And these are, this is what one of the complications of relationships in general. I mean, it's staggering that, and you may look at a chart you think it's going to work out fine and not necessarily does. I mean, circumstances. And I was going to say, as a digression right here, is that you may have a relationship that gets dinged by a transit coming across that part of your relationship. And then sort of, all bets are off, and sometimes you can't recover from that, but sometimes you can. So.
No, absolutely. What do you think about Jupiter in the 7th house? I mean, talk about attracting helpful people.
Yeah. I would think that'd be somebody who could be a sugar daddy, or somebody who, a cougar, or somebody who wants to take care of you, and is willing to be generous in that regard. So there's a sense of that.
It's, again, another, it's a greater fortune. It's, again, very often a popular placement. A lot of friends. Yeah, usually I didn't say popular. And it is generous, but I do find that Jupiter in the 7th house, like if you need help or something's going on, it's sort of somebody, I'm saying they magically appear, but it is very fortunate for helpful people. Yeah,
wherever Jupiter tends to be helpful for the most part, but it can also be, I suppose, every planet has its pluses and minuses. It can also, I suppose, amplify issues as well. There's a certain sense of grandness to them, maybe a little bit overly dramatic, perhaps sometimes too.
A little bit over the top, sure.
Yeah, I could see that.
Depending where it falls, but, the sign that it's in, but definitely so. But both Venus and Jupiter, I will say, together can bring in, I will say, beneficial. If you're going for business partners, let's say, I can say beneficial relationships.
Mm-hmm. And where, bringing back to Saturn, there's a certain sense of reservation with Saturn. Just touching on that real quickly, I just thought about that. Reservation and perhaps conservatism, maybe a little bit restrained, a little bit... what's the word I want? Subdued or, withdrawn just a bit, because there's that sense of seriousness there.
It is serious. That's why it takes relationships seriously. And Saturn, especially when I was younger, this was true. It's more conservative and it's more aware of reputation and what people might think. Yeah. So, and I can think back to when I was younger, and it can be a little bit, quite frankly, it could be kind of judgmental.
Yeah, I could see that. Yeah. I think the judgment comes probably from their ability to say, are you doing the right thing? It's sort of, like your mother, clean up your bedroom, one of those things. It's Saturday morning, clean up your bedroom before you go out. And I think that's okay. I also think that there's a sense of depth there, which I like as well, because there's, when they're in for the long haul. They're not one that's typically just not a joyride, for lack of a better word.
But they do pick up, I will say this for Saturn in the 7th house, they do their share of the work, and they'll do more than their share of the work. Mm-hmm.
And that can cause an imbalance. Now, that's something that's really, really important to understand about relationships. Oftentimes you'll see, I've seen clients who've had relationships where one person gives far more than the other, even though the other person may think that they're doing their part. It's not always, I wouldn't go so far as to say have a checklist or a laundry list of things that you've done versus what the other has done, because I don't think they're equally measurable in that regard. I mean, someone may do the laundry every week and you mow the lawn. Okay, that may be a balance, but if somebody is, buying all the groceries every week and you're not doing anything, then there's a problem. So you can see how that works.
Well, reality is nothing's 50-50, but again, it's not supposed to be 80-20, right?
Well, that's my point. Yeah, I mean, 60-40 is probably okay. You can get by with that, but you got to compensate. I mean, it does come down to balance.
And not being a scorekeeper. If you're too much of a scorekeeper, that becomes an issue. And on that note, Pluto in the 7th house can be a scorekeeper.
Yeah, I don't like scorekeepers.
You do for me. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, that's transactional in that regard. So that means that if I do the laundry, then you're going to mow the lawn. And then there's going to be an insistence on that. And I think that's interesting. I think that whole idea, I don't like the tit for tat kind of thing, that transactional quality of I've been in relationships where that's happened. And I just don't like it. Because I felt I've always done a lot. Maybe people felt differently, but whatever. Well,
I have a Libra moon, so I know I've done a lot,
yes. But
so accommodating, accommodating. Well, but Pluto in the 7th house, I will say this, because again, that can be a tough placement when it comes to relationships. It's a very strong energy.
Yeah. And it can mean, I think there's a certain sense of fate involved with that kind of relationship if it's there, because it has a longer thread attached to it, for lack of a better term, that I think brings into it perhaps a past life or a time where this person is meant to be more meaningful to you than you may realize.
When I see Pluto involved strongly in relationships, to me, I always think of it as like from here through eternity.
Yeah, through eternity.
Yeah.
Not from here to eternity, but from here through eternity.
Because Pluto in the seventh, in terms of the personality, the person is, again, it's more than they're committed to relationship. Yeah, Saturn's committed to relationship. But Pluto in the seventh house takes it even beyond that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really, Pluto is a pretty heavy orb. We can't deny that. And I'm glad to see that it finally got, assigned planetary measures of, the title at least, instead of being a dwarf planet. But it's a very powerful placement. And there's a whole branch of astrology that's dedicated just to that alone, just studying the whole evolutionary astrology based on the presence of Pluto on the outer planets in your chart and what role you have in regard to manifesting that.
Yep. And let's see, who else? Oh, Uranus.
Uranus. Oh, my gosh. How could we miss that one?
Oh, my goodness. So having Uranus in the seventh house. Now, I'll tell you what I love about Uranus in the seventh house, or even Aquarius on the seventh for that matter. People who have Uranus in the seventh, the astrologically rules, we think, relationships, they may be unstable. They're always interesting, and they can start and stop. That's the thing about people with Uranus in the seventh. You could be friends, and then you don't hear from them for 3 months, and then they just pick up the phone and call you. But by the same token, if you're sort of out of touch, you can pick up the phone. They don't stand on ceremony. They're not saying like, well, where the heck have you been for the past, 2 months? Pick right up where they left off.
I think that's very valid. They also, I think, tend to be a little more out of the norm. They may be a little bit, unconventional relationships. Now, what is that, Laura? What's an unconventional relationship? Well, you could say all relationships are unconventional, or you could say no relationship's unconventional. But I think what unconventional might mean is there might be a situation where you're in you get together with somebody who comes from a blended family, for example, or, there's been a time in their lives when the relationships were quite sporadic, or there's a certain eccentricity to them as well. Rebellion.
Well, I think unconventional is sort of relative to the society at the time, right?
Yes, exactly.
But I'll use the word certainly freedom. If you've got Uranus in the seventh house, they like their own space.
Yeah, I think that's very valid. And you're right about that, because what's conventional is it changes with each generation. I mean, what we think of as normal or acceptable, my parents probably never would have thought was acceptable.
Absolutely. So that's why I say it. So it is always changing.
Yeah.
But Uranus also in the seventh house, besides, I want to say, the freedom, very often if you've got Uranus in the seventh house, they're attracted, the relationships that they get involved with, there's usually or commonly a significant difference. And it can be an age difference, a difference in culture, a difference in race. And that difference makes it all the more interesting.
Right. That's I like that idea. And I think that's very much what people would be looking for. But that may be seen as a norm today, because in our society today, we are very tolerant of hopefully many of us are tolerant of lots of different kinds of relationships. Some of us aren't.
No, but we've come a long way since the 60s.
We've come a long way, baby, as they said, the old Virginia Slims ad.
Which, yep, I remember
we're really
that.
dating ourselves now by talking about that. I know, geez, even the fact that there's a cigarette in the commercial. But
I know.
But we didn't talk about the sun or the moon. And so how could we miss that? We just glossed right over that.
Oh, my God. Shame on you for forgetting that. So let's start with the sun. And the sun in the seventh house, usually the person is very relationship oriented.
I would say dependent upon it.
Yeah.
I would say I think it's a definite piece of their personality. Without that, I think a seventh house sun indicates a person who needs to be in a relationship. Whether that's good or bad, or whether it's a healthy or unhappy one, it has to be there. I think they have to be in a relationship of some sort.
It's part of their identity.
Yeah,
to some degree, I agree. It's part of their identity.
Yeah.
And if it doesn't work out, they take it very hard.
Right. And they, or else they try to fill it back up again. If they are in a relationship that gets broken, they will dash out and rebound like crazy, I think, because it's almost part of their DNA. I know this because I have a seventh house sun.
Oh, that's right. Oh, gee, that's right.
Well, what are you going to do? I've always been in a relationship all my life, and I found that when they ended, I was out back in the run looking again for another one to fill in the void. And, it's a trial and error situation at that point, but at least I was trying. Very trying.
And hopefully having fun, right?
Of course. Yeah, no, I understand that. But I do feel that. I mean, I've always felt at my core that I was meant to be in a relationship. I like the interchange. I like the exchange of ideas and conversation. It's just who I am. But when we look at the moon there, now we see it's a whole nother ball of wax.
Yes, it is. So the moon, emotional, nurturing, but the moon also fluctuates.
Sure does.
And so wherever we find the moon in the chart, there's usually some fluctuation. So for many people who have the moon in the seventh house, relationships aren't always the smoothest path. I mean, it depends on the whole chart, but there can be some ups and downs or some changes connected to relationships.
Well, I think what happens there is if you have a moon in the seventh, you've got to be treated very gently. You've got to be handled with kid gloves because your sensitivity factor is quite high. And when you're intimate with somebody or when you're in a close situation and you're seeing them closely, the slightest thing could set someone off like that because they take it the wrong way. That's that sort of, you think of the visual of the crab. I always do this when I'm talking about the moon, and I think of Cancer. It's that the crab's underneath the water and something comes after me, backs into a corner with his pincers out, trying to keep people away or whatever the outside threat is away. I think that's indicative of a sensitive sort of person in that regard.
And too, with the moon, thinking along, I'm going to say those lines. That's why sometimes people with the moon in the seventh house can be a little bit slow to commit. I mean, they're committed, but to make things more formal, sometimes, it can take them a little. I just see that. I think it can take them a little time to really make that.
I think there's a little bit
commitment.
Of
Hesitancy.
Hesitancy is exactly right, and I think that I think the hesitancy comes from a willingness to open up. If they open up completely, then they feel vulnerable. This is the thing, and that's that vulnerability that you can easily take someone down who is a vulnerable person, and that's where the trust comes in, and that's a very difficult. You got to test that one for a while. You're right.
Yeah, that's why, because, the other thing with the moon, I was going to say to you in the seventh house, because it is nurturing. And seventh house moons generally, depends on the sign it's in, I'm going to qualify it with that, but they generally like to spend time with the partner. That closeness, that family, that sense of your partner's part of your tribe. Right. That's important to them. That's
sort of that day-to-day repartee, the dialogue, the exchange. This is not the kind of person who wants to be married to a traveling salesperson or whatever who's gone all the time. They want someone who's going to be home, someone that they can nurture. And in many ways, being in a relationship is a way of expressing your love. And the expression of love outward is as much of a gift and a asset to a relationship as it is to receive. I think that there has to be that symbiotic. There's a lot of joy in giving to people. If you can make somebody else happy, that's a very wonderful thing. And that has to be balanced, of course.
Because it's always about balance. And the natural ruler of the seventh house, and right in the natural zodiac, is Libra, the sign of balance and boundaries.
Perfect. What could be better? We knew that. And that's why, having a Libra moon, you are that woman.
That's it. Thank you.
But when we talk about, what I think interesting, I always think of the seventh house as obviously romantic lovers, but I also think of it as close friends. And of course, you extended it beyond that, which we can open up that umbrella very wide and bring in any relationship to us. Obviously, I think some of those fall in different parts of your lives, but for the most part, I think the seventh house is reflective of that. And those close friends that you have, those friends that perhaps you want to hang on to. Of course, there's a lot of other variables, the sun, the moon, the rising sign, all those variables get entered into it. But it's important to recognize that it's more than just your average lover. I think people tend to generalize that very quickly, that it's just, your significant other, your partner.
No, they're long-term friends, and I have friends, and I'm actually kind of proud of this because I have friends really since I'm about 13 years old. Still friends with them. I have a few of them. And you look at the charts, and I always love to do this. You can say, we attract certain people, especially if we're talking about friends. It may not be the same as our lovers, those type of partners. And, I've got Sagittarius on my seventh house. And so I attract Sagittarians, Sagittarius rising.
Yeah, I totally get that. Yeah, I do. I can see that. I've got Venus on my, I've got Pisces on my seventh house cusp. And I have a lot of people who in my life who are very strong Pisces people. Of course, I've got Moon in Cancer, which also brings that water out, but it certainly is there. And I can see that.
Well, just on that note, Jupiter rules my seventh house. It's conjunct Neptune. And almost every one of my friends, I've got Pisces suns, Pisces moons. There's always something, Venus in Pisces, there's something strong in Pisces. So it's always fascinating. It never gets old for me.
Never gets old. And that's what's amazing about astrology. And that's why it's important to understand the depth that we're trying to present here. That because when you understand these basics, you can actually make conscious decisions about who to be with if you know enough about them. And to me, it's fascinating. Of course, circumstances do enter into it. Familial baggage enters into it. If you're married and you got children and you fall in love, I mean, you got a problem on your hands. But there's certain things that you also say, if I'm going to be in a relationship, what's the one that's going to serve me the best over the long haul? And you have to take into account a lot of different things. And some people just, it's not just a matter of hooking up.
Well, and that's where it comes into what do you need for that enduring relationship? Because that's a big difference. The fifth house is a house of romance, but it's kind of Mr. and Ms. right now. Do they make it into the seventh house?
That's where the rubber hits the road. And I think that it gets complicated because a couple may be okay, but can they sustain a layoff of one of the partners? Could they sustain the loss of a house? Relationships are challenged. Relationships, you have to be able to endure the good with the bad. And if you can hang in there through those times, that's a symbol. That's where the Saturn, I think, in the seventh house would be very valuable for someone, hanging in there through thick and thin. For better, for worse. For better, for worse, for better and worse. And again, I'm just going to go back to this because if a relationship, they start in the fifth house. And that's the point. You go out, you're dating, it's a lot of fun. Then you start to get serious. You start making some type of, commitments. Eventually it transforms. It becomes a seventh house relationship. And that's why sometimes if you look at the fifth house, you can have a great fifth house. The romances can start easily. You can be, Mr. and Ms. popular. But when they go that extra distance and get into the seventh house, then it becomes a seventh house relationship. And then that seventh house, the aspects, the planets, that starts to take, has a lot more influence. Right. And we all know that the first 5, 6, 8, 10, 12 months of a relationship are always the hottest and the best. And then things settle into, sort of a routine. And then it's, can you make it through the ho-hum years or not? Well, that's the point. When it gets out of the fifth house, the house of fun, the house of pleasure, right? Yep. The house of, to me, like every day is Christmas. But then it gets into the seventh house, and that is about that commitment and the long haul. And that's where you get in. The fifth house is more about the better. The seventh house brings in, the better and the worse. I can recall being in a relationship, in a fifth house relationship that started out, and I came back home and told my friends, I'm madly in love. This girl is the best thing I've ever seen in my life. This is going to be it. And it didn't last. And then I felt like a fool. And I looked back and said, gosh, look at the things I said about this person back then. And now I can't stand them. What is going on here? Or it just didn't work. One of those things. But well, you might have been under the influence. It's interesting. If you look back at that year. Well, I was going to be nice and say under the influence of a transit. But maybe Uranus was, striking Venus in your chart. Hit and run. I had stars in my eyes. So anyway, well, that's the seventh house, folks. And we're just going to continue on. We'll get to another one in a couple of weeks. We'll get on to the 10th house. But what do you think? In summary, anything else, Deborah, you want to add about this wonderful house? About the wonderful house of the seventh house? I'm just going to say, to wrap it up, at least as far as I'm concerned with the seventh house, certainly one of the most important houses in the wheel because it does involve others. And really, I'm going to say more important because it is reflective. There's a certain part of it that's a mirror. It shows you what you lack. It shows you what you need. And you really need to, I think, if people would just pay more attention to it from a rational sense, I'm going to say the logical sense, like when you're not involved with a relationship, and really take notes. I just think it just would be so helpful for all relationships across the board. Yeah. I think the mirroring piece is the largest part because, any relationship is going to bring you some sort of wisdom. It's going to teach you a lot about yourself and about the other person. But I think what they bring to you and what you learn and how you grow in that relationship, I think that's a large part of it, because we start out, a relationship should be a journey. It shouldn't just be an episode. It shouldn't just be a chapter. It should be a whole book. And there's going to be good chapters. There's going to be exciting chapters. There's going to be unpleasant chapters. But I think it's the ability to hold in there and see what you can learn about yourself through the relationship that is really the most valuable piece. So it's really about self-awareness and self-discovery. So well said. All right. And on that note, we'll wrap it up. I'm Debra Ann Clement. I'm Chris Flisher. And this is He Says, She Says. Astrology. Someday we'll get that right. But someday we will. That's okay. No worries. All right. I'll talk to you soon, Deb. Talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to He Says, She Says Astrology Podcast. For more information or to schedule a private and personal reading by either Chris Flisher or Debra Clement, visit chrisflisher.com, turningofthewheel.com, or debraclementastrologer.com, and subscribe for more great podcasts in the future.